On the frozen edge of Montana's wilderness, a battle-scarred veteran thought he had left war behind. But when a colossal wild horse emerged from the mist and lured him into the forest, he followed against every instinct. What waited for him beyond the trees was no legend of hoof and shadow, but an abandoned Gothic estate, a place locals never dared to mention. Inside its rotting halls, the truth he uncovered would shatter the line between history and nightmare. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The summer was waning when Daniel Rohr came home. Montana spread out beneath a pale blue sky. Its mountains were faint on the horizon, like shadows pressed against glass. Its fields of wild grass were dry and restless in the breeze. Lone Ridge, the town where Daniel had grown up, barely stirred at the edge of all that emptiness. It was a small grid of streets and weathered storefronts, the kind of place where silence carried farther than voices. The wind moved through, sharp with the smell of sun-baked dirt and pine resin. And to Daniel, it felt like a cruel reminder of where he had been. Because the quiet here was nothing like the silence of war. He had spent 10 years in the Marine Corps, and the quiet of war was always temporary. It was the gap between mortars, the heartbeat before a rifle cracked, the breath you took when you weren't sure if it would be your last. Lone Ridge was silent in another way, as if the town itself had forgotten how to make noise. Even the distant hum of a truck on the highway seemed to vanish before it reached him. Daniel stepped off the last bus with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He wore jeans and a plain shirt, boots dusty from travel. His hair was cropped short, the way the Corps demanded. The muscles beneath his clothes were hardened from years of training, but his face told the truer story. Tired, lined in places that a man of 38 should not yet be lined. His eyes holding the haunted watchfulness of someone who had slept too often with a rifle within reach. The driver closed the door behind him and rumbled away. Daniel stood by the roadside a long moment, feeling the prairie air wrap around him, thinner and colder than the desert winds of Afghanistan. He looked across the rolling fields, already tinged with the gold of late summer, and saw the fence line of the Callahan Ranch sagging in the distance. His father's land. His land now, though he had never wanted it. He adjusted the duffel and started walking. The ranch revealed itself slowly, each step stripping away the image of childhood he had carried and replacing it with ruin. The wooden gate was hanging by one hinge, paint long gone, wood splintered. The driveway was more weeds than gravel, grass rising almost to his waist, thick and brittle from neglect. He passed the horse paddock where he had once ridden bareback as a boy. Now the posts leaned, rails broken, whole sections collapsed as if a storm had blown through. The house came next, a squat timber structure with a porch that sagged under its own weight, shingles peeling from the roof like scabs. The windows were clouded by dust, curtains drawn, a rocking chair sat abandoned in the corner of the porch. One armrest was cracked, the seat grey with weather. Daniel slowed, his chest tightening. This was not the home he had left. It was something smaller, weaker, like a body left too long without care. Beyond the house stretched the pasture. He saw the movement there. 3 horses, ribs sharp against their hides, their heads lifting wearily as he approached. Their eyes followed him with the suspicion of creatures who had learned not to expect kindness. Daniel stopped at the fence, gripped the top rail. It crumbled beneath his hand, leaving splinters in his palm. For a long moment, he simply stood there, letting the reality sink in. This ranch was both alien and familiar. He could almost see his father's figure in the distance, striding across the field with his stubborn gait, barking orders about fence repairs or hay bales. But Everett Rohr was gone now, dead 3 months. Heart stopped in the night, and Daniel had not been there. The horses shifted uneasily. One let out a thinned, exhausted whinny. Daniel set his jaw. He dropped the duffel on the porch and pushed open the door. Inside, the air was colder than he expected. The living room was stripped down to almost nothing. A coffee table stood under a blanket of dust. A single lamp leaned at an angle, its shade stained. The old rocking chair sat near the fireplace like a sentry abandoned at its post. His footsteps echoed against bare walls. He set the duffel down and rubbed a hand over his face. This was his inheritance, Not wealth, not a future, just silence and decay. The truth of his father's death came to him in fragments over those first days. Everett Raw had gone quietly. Neighbors said a heart weakened over the years had finally failed, leaving him collapsed in his chair. There had been a funeral, but Daniel was halfway around the world when the news came. He had been pinned down in a dust-choked valley trying to keep his squad alive. And by the time he made it back to base, the burial was already over. The guilt sat heavy in his chest. He had buried comrades with his own hands, but he had not been there for his own father. And worse still, he and Everett had parted on cold terms. Their last conversation nearly a year ago had been strained, his father urging him to come home and take responsibility, Daniel insisting he belonged where his men were. Now there was no chance to reconcile, no chance to ask the questions he had always avoided. Did his father ever understand him? Did he ever care? The only answers came from papers Daniel found in the desk drawer. Old veterinary bills, carefully kept photographs of him as a boy on a pony, a sealed envelope that served as a will. Everett had left him the ranch without explanation, no note, no parting words. The silence of it cut deeper than any bullet wound. At night, the silence became unbearable. Daniel lay on the sofa, boots still on, staring at the wooden ceiling beams, while the wind whispered through cracks in the walls. He closed his eyes, but sleep never came peacefully. The war followed him. Dreams dragged him back to night raids, to the metallic taste of fear, to explosions ripping the world apart. He heard the screams of his friends, saw the flash of IEDs tearing through convoys. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as if he were back in the desert. He sat up in the dark, palms pressed to his eyes. The room around him was empty, except for the creak of the old house. Sometimes he imagined he saw his father's shadow standing in the doorway, silent, judging. By day he threw himself into work. It was the only thing that kept him from drowning in memory. Daniel rose at 5 every morning, just as he had in the Corps. He fed the remaining horses, carrying bales of hay that crumbled too easily, filling water troughs that froze overnight. He shoveled out the stalls, the smell of mold clinging to his clothes. Then he moved on to repairs. Fence posts were reset, rails hammered into place. Though for every one he fixed, 2 more seemed to collapse. The ranch was simply too far gone. Progress was slow, discouraging, but he pressed on with the stubborn discipline that had once kept him alive. Each action became a ritual. The swing of the hammer, the scrape of the shovel, the measured steps across the yard. He wasn't rebuilding so much as surviving, the way he had in war. One task at a time, one breath at a time. He avoided people as much as possible. The trip into town for supplies was quick and silent. Groceries, nails, sacks of feed. He spoke little, offered curt nods, and left. Lone Ridge had never been kind to solitude, but Daniel could not bring himself to linger among curious stares. The ranch was his prison and his refuge, both. When the work was done and night fell again, the loneliness grew heavier. He would sit on the porch wrapped in his jacket, listening to the horses shift restlessly in the pasture. Sometimes one of them cried out, the sound thin and frightened. Sometimes an owl called from the pines. More often, there was nothing at all. Lying on the old sofa, he let the dark close around him. Inevitably, the nightmares returned. In one, he saw his squad pinned under fire, sand and blood filling the air. In another, he saw Everett at the ranch gate, his face hidden by shadow, saying nothing, while Daniel shouted apologies that went unheard. He woke gasping, clutching the armrest, eyes darting across the empty room. The fire had long since died. The only sound was the wind sneaking through cracks and the distant plaintive whinny of a horse. He leaned forward, head in his hands. "I'm back," he whispered, voice raw, "but I'm not living." The words hung in the air, unanswered, swallowed by the silence of the Montana night. The late afternoon sun stretched low across the Montana prairie, throwing long shadows that cut through the waving grass. The heat of the day had passed, leaving the air cool, touched with a dampness that drifted from the forest on the western edge of the Callahan Ranch. Daniel Raw walked along the fence line with a hammer in one hand. A coil of barbed wire looped across his shoulder. He moved with the slow patience of a man used to work that had no end. Boots flattening grass that had grown chest-high, tools clanking softly against his hip. The western fence was the worst. Several sections had collapsed entirely, rails scattered like broken bones, posts half buried in weeds. Coyotes could have slipped through, maybe even deer, though what there was to keep in or out hardly mattered anymore. Daniel didn't fix fences because the ranch demanded it. He fixed them because it gave his hand something to do, his mind something steady to hold. The world around him was quiet, too quiet. Normally the air carried the distant murmur of birds or the faint rustle of animals in the brush. But tonight there was nothing. No calls, no movement, only the low sigh of wind through pine. Daniel noticed it the way a soldier notices the stillness before an ambush. He slowed, senses sharp, hammer loose in his hand. His boots pressed into the soil, and he could hear every step as if the ground itself were listening. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, and for the first time since returning home, he felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. He wasn't alone. The sound came suddenly, a deep, resonant whinny that rolled through the air like thunder. Daniel froze. The noise had come from the tree line, no more than 50 yards ahead. Slowly, he turned. His eyes scanned the edge of the forest where sunlight poured in one last golden wash before sinking behind the ridges. And there it was. A horse stepped from the shadows, but no horse Daniel had ever known. It was massive, towering over the average Mustang by at least a hand and a half. Its coat was a dark sheen, almost black, though the setting sun caught on the ridges of muscle along its flanks. The mane was long and wild, tangled like storm-tossed rope, and its eyes, God, its eyes glimmered with a strange intensity. They were not the dull, weary eyes of an untamed creature. They looked directly into him, unflinching, sharp, as if measuring his worth. Daniel's own horses reacted first. From the pasture behind him came the sudden scrape of hooves and the startled squeal of panic. The gaunt animals tossed their heads, ears pinned flat, retreating to the far end of the enclosure as though confronted by a predator. One stamped and bolted, nearly tangling itself in the broken rails. "Easy," Daniel muttered, raising his free hand to calm them, though his own pulse hammered in his ears. He turned back to the black stallion, unwilling to let it out of his sight. The animal stood with muscles taut, chest broad, hooves planted firmly in the dirt. It did not rear or flee. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, eyes never leaving him, as if waiting. Daniel had faced men with rifles, had walked into ambushes where his next step might trigger an IED. None of that had made his heart pound the way it did now. The stallion dug its hoof into the soil, a deliberate motion. The sound rang heavy, louder than it should have been, reverberating through the fence post beneath Daniel's palm. Dust rose, hanging in the light like smoke. The gesture was not fear. It was not aggression. It was something else. Something Daniel couldn't define. A challenge, perhaps. Or an invitation. His breath came shallow. This wasn't how wild horses behaved. Any other Mustang would have bolted by now, vanishing back into the timber. This one remained, anchored, a black shadow against the dying sun. Daniel swallowed hard, throat dry. His mind flickered to stories he'd overheard as a boy in Lone Ridge, the kind whispered in saloons and at campfires. Legends of a giant horse roaming the mountains, a beast too large to be natural, too cunning to be hunted. Some called it a spirit, others a curse. His father had dismissed such tales as nonsense, but children listened, and those whispers had never fully left him. Now, seeing the stallion in the flesh, Daniel felt as though he was staring at the embodiment of every story rolled into one. The horse moved first. It shifted its weight, turned with deliberate grace, and began to walk back toward the forest. Its hooves struck the earth with a steady rhythm, each step echoing. After several paces it stopped, lifted its head, and looked back over its shoulder. The gaze was unmistakable, a beckoning. Then it continued on. Daniel's chest tightened. The sun had nearly set, light draining quickly from the fields, leaving the forest rim in shadow. The trees rose like black sentinels, their branches interlocked, a curtain hiding whatever lay beyond. The stallion's figure slipped into that darkness, only to pause again, turning to ensure he watched. It was not flight, it was guidance. The air grew cooler. Daniel's arms prickled. The moment felt unreal, like standing at the edge of two worlds. The safe familiarity of his ranch and whatever waited beyond those trees. He remembered the words of an old ranch hand he'd overheard once. Some horses aren't beasts, they're gatekeepers. You follow them, you don't come back the same. The stallion lifted its head again, mane tossing in the wind. Daniel gripped the hammer tighter. He hesitated, torn. Every part of his training told him not to follow. Dusk in the Montana forest meant danger. Low visibility, predators on the move. Uneven ground waiting to break an ankle. Logic said, return to the house, lock the doors, forget the apparition he'd just witnessed. But something deeper urged him on. The stallion's presence was no accident. The look in its eyes carried intent, as if it knew more than any animal should. Daniel's instincts, the same that had saved him in ambushes overseas, told him this was not a random encounter. It was a summons. He turned to his own horses, still restless, ears flicking nervously. He stroked the neck of the closest, whispering reassurance. Then he tied the rest to a broken post of the fence, anchoring them as best he could. Stay here, he murmured, his voice low, almost ashamed of speaking to them like comrades. I need to see what this is. He stepped back, adjusted the knife sheathed at his belt, and felt for the small flashlight in his pocket. The air carried the last note of warmth before night swallowed the land. The stallion was waiting. Daniel drew a deep breath. His chest rose and fell once, steadying as he crossed the broken fence line. The forest loomed, its darkness absolute now that the sun was gone. He flicked the flashlight on, the thin beam cutting through the gloom, bouncing off trunks slick with moss. The smell hit him immediately. Damp earth, pine needles, a hint of rot beneath the sweetness. Ahead, the rhythmic thud of hooves continued, guiding him deeper. Each step took him further from the safety of the ranch, deeper into the unknown. He thought of his father's silence, of the nightmares that had stalked him since returning home, of the guilt that clung like a second skin. Now something larger than his own grief beckoned him forward. The stallion moved into the trees without fear. Daniel followed, swallowed by the shadows, and the forest closed around them, cold and endless, as if he had stepped through a doorway into another life. The forest thickened as Daniel followed the stallion's trail. 15 minutes had passed since he'd stepped beyond the broken fence line, but it might as well have been hours. The world behind him, the ranch, the pasture, the mountains glinting in the distance, had dissolved into memory. What remained was shadow. The air grew colder the deeper he went. Pines rose around him, towering like pillars, their branches interlaced to blot out what little light remained of the day. The narrow beam of his flashlight jittered across trunks scarred with age, slick with moss, and roots that jutted like bones from the earth. Ahead he heard the steady rhythm of hooves. Sometimes he glimpsed the stallion's dark shape between trees, a flicker of muscle and mane. Then it vanished, swallowed by fog seeping low to the ground. Each sound of hoof against soil carried like a signal, guiding him forward, luring him deeper. He adjusted the knife at his belt, hand brushing the hilt more often than he admitted to himself. His heartbeat was no longer steady. It pulsed sharp, the way it had in Afghanistan when stepping into hostile alleys. The forest wasn't a battlefield, yet the same tension clenched his gut. The sense that danger was near, unseen, waiting. And then abruptly, the trees opened. Daniel stumbled out of the choke of pine into a wide clearing. The fog thinned, revealing a sight so incongruous it pulled the breath from his lungs. A mansion rose from the heart of the forest. It stood immense, built of grey-black stone, its walls streaked with moss, its turrets and chimneys clawing upward like broken teeth. A rusted iron gate hung crookedly on one hinge, groaning when the wind shoved against it. Beyond lay a courtyard drowned in weeds that rose chest-high, smothering what had once been neat paths of cracked stone. A fountain sat in ruin at the center, its basin choked with leaves, its carved figures worn faceless by rain. The house itself was Gothic in stature, oppressive in silence. Windows yawned dark and hollow, shutters torn away. The roof sagged in places, yet the bulk of it remained intact, as if time had tried and failed to erase it. Iron hoofs stood before the gate, immense and still, one hoof striking the ground with a deliberate pound. The sound reverberated through the clearing like a judge's gavel, confirming that this was indeed where Daniel was meant to be. Daniel stopped, breath steaming in the air. Awe mingled with dread in his chest. He took a step back without realizing it. His eyes moved across the facade, and fragments of childhood whispers stirred in memory. There had always been talk in Lone Ridge of a house hidden in the forest, a house no one visited, no one named aloud. He remembered hushed voices at the diner, older men with whiskey-burnt tongues muttering about the Ashthorne family and their disappearance decades ago. Some said they had fled west after a scandal. Others claimed they had been cursed. Children whispered bolder things. The Ashthorns still live there, feeding off travelers, keeping secrets no one dared reveal. His father had called it nonsense. But Everett Raw had never looked him in the eye when he said so. And here it was, the shape of the myth, solid and undeniable. Daniel swallowed. Ashthorne Manor, he muttered, the words foreign and heavy on his tongue. The gate creaked open under his hand, reluctant but yielding. He stepped through, boots sinking into wild grass. Iron hoof stayed where it was, a sentinel, unmoving, its eyes reflecting the last smear of dusk. It did not follow. Daniel approached the doors. They were wood thick as vault doors, carved with patterns long eroded, hinges corroded to rust. When he pushed, the sound was a scream. Metal grinding, wood protesting, echoing like the cry of something being torn from its grave. The smell struck him instantly. Damp rot, mold, the acrid tang of old wood, long starved of air. He raised his flashlight. The beam sliced into a hallway, vast and cold. The walls were stone, cracked, and lined with ivy that had forced its way inside. The ceiling arched high overhead, cobwebs hanging like rotted banners. The floor was marble, though cracked and water-stained, puddles gathered in depressions. Somewhere deeper in the house came the slow drip of water, steady as a heartbeat. Daniel stepped inside, and the door groaned shut behind him, sealing out the forest. The beam of light felt pathetically small against the expanse of shadow. This wasn't merely an abandoned house, it was a monument to decay, a cathedral of silence. Portraits lined the hallway, dust clung to every frame, and the paint within had dulled to shades of shadow, but the figures remained distinct. Men in tailored suits with faces stern, eyes sharp as blades. Women in gowns stiff with pride, hands resting on children posed like dolls. The Ashthorns, generation after generation, their gazes frozen in time. Daniel's boots stirred dust as he moved. Some portraits had been slashed, canvases torn, faces obliterated by angry hands. Others had grown mottled with mold, green blossoms blooming across pale skin. Yet one portrait loomed larger than the rest. A man with silver hair and an expression carved from stone. His painted eyes seemed to pierce the gloom, following Daniel wherever he stepped. He turned away, unease clawing at his back. On the floor lay shattered glass, the remains of goblets, as though a feast had been interrupted mid-toast. Chairs lay overturned, tables splintered. The scene spoke of flight, of people leaving not in peace, but in panic. The house wasn't empty by choice, it had been abandoned in haste. He pushed deeper into what must have been the study. The smell of mildew was stronger here. A desk slumped in the corner, one leg broken, drawers jammed. Shelves lined the walls, their books collapsed in heaps, pages yellowed, spines gnawed by time. A filing cabinet had toppled, its contents strewn across the floor in a paper graveyard. Daniel crouched, lifting envelopes brittle with age. He brushed dust from faded ink. Letters from banks, correspondence with mining companies. One document bore the seal of a local bank, granting rights to a silver mine in the hills. Another referred obliquely to special funding from government offices, though no details followed. He frowned. Why would a wealthy family rely on such secretive financing? His hand struck something solid beneath the pile. He pulled free a small journal, its cover of brown leather warped with moisture, pages swollen. The handwriting inside was jagged, slanting, like the author had written in haste or under duress. Daniel flipped through, flashlight trembling slightly in his grasp. The words chilled him. The subjects resist, but they must not be allowed to leave. For every secret, blood must flow. He turned a page. The ink had blurred with water, yet the words pressed deep, etched into the paper like scars. We test again. The walls hold their cries, but still they echo. Blood must flow. Blood must flow. The phrase repeated over and over across multiple entries, sometimes scrawled, sometimes neat, as though written by different hands or at different stages of sanity. Daniel's stomach tightened. He recognized the stain smeared across the paper. Not only ink, but something darker, brown-red, sunk deep into the fibers. Blood, long dried. He shut the journal quickly, throat tight, breath shallow. The house seemed to contract around him, shadows swelling, the air heavier, the portraits in the hall, the drip of water, the smell of rot. All pressed closer, suffocating. He slid the journal into his jacket, instinct telling him it mattered, that it was evidence, or maybe a warning. A shriek of wind funneled through a crack in the walls. It howled along the hallways, making the doors shudder, making the house itself moan like something alive. Daniel stiffened, every nerve taut. For a heartbeat he thought he heard words carried in that wind, a scream stretched thin by distance. He turned to the doorway, flashlight shaking. Outside, through a broken pane, he saw Iron Hoof still at the gate. The stallion did not move, did not enter. Its silhouette was stark against the fog, immovable, like a sentinel refusing to cross a boundary. Daniel licked dry lips. "You brought me here," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible above the wind. "You wanted me to see this. But why? What else are you keeping from me?" The horse's ears flicked, catching his words, then it stilled again, silent as the grave. Daniel looked back at the journal, pressing cold against his chest. The words etched there burned in his mind. Blood must flow to keep the secret. He realized then that what he had uncovered was only the surface. The true heart of Ashthorne Manor remained buried, waiting. And whatever waited below was not yet done with him. Daniel left the ruined study with the leather-bound journal heavy in his coat pocket. The words, "Blood must flow to keep the secret," seemed to echo louder than the creak of his boots across the stone floor. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, sweeping its beam across the hall. Dust swirled, his breath fogged. That was when he smelled it. It wasn't the damp mildew that clung to the rest of the manor. This was sharper, more intrusive. An acrid cocktail of rusted iron, dried blood, and a chemical sting. It seeped from the floorboards, subtle at first, then undeniable. Daniel paused, nostrils flaring. He'd known that stench before. Far from Montana, the copper tang of blood on hot sand and the antiseptic bite of field hospitals. He crouched, pressing a hand against the warped planks. The odor seeped strongest from cracks near the hallway's end. His mind snapped back to the journal, to the scrawled lines about experiments, about secrets kept through sacrifice. His chest tightened. The smell was rising from below. Daniel moved forward, every step measured. At the far end of the corridor, hidden in shadow, a small iron door squatted low against the wall. Its surface was crusted with rust. The lock was corroded but intact, chain links wound through it like veins. To anyone else, it might have looked like a disused storage hatch. But Daniel knew better. The stench pouring from its seams told another story. He set his flashlight between his teeth, freeing his hands. His gaze swept the hall. A broken banister lay near the stairwell, one rail splintered loose. He wrenched it free. The wood cracked, leaving him with a jagged length of iron-studded timber, enough to serve as a pry bar. Daniel jammed the rail into the lock. He leaned his weight into it. The metal screamed, echoing down the deserted hallways like a chorus of the dead. The sound clawed at his nerves. From outside came an answering cry from Iron Hoof, a thunderous, guttural whinny that rattled the broken windows. Daniel bared his teeth, pushed harder. The lock strained, then snapped with a final metallic shriek. A gust of air rolled up from the darkness below, hot and rancid. Daniel gagged, yanking his shirt over his nose. It was like the exhalation of a crypt, a breath that carried decades of rot. He gathered himself, switched the flashlight back into his grip, and aimed it into the stairwell. Wooden steps descended into blackness, their edges sagged with decay, nails jutting, surfaces mottled with mold. The smell doubled, pressing against his throat, urging him to turn back. He didn't. Each step moaned beneath him as he descended, dust plumed, swirling in the beam. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Not the fresh cold of mountain air, but the stagnant chill of stone sealed from the sun. The light cut through the dark to reveal cages. Rows of them stretched down either side of the chamber, wrought from iron bars now brown with rust. The shapes were unmistakable, cells. Inside, dark stains painted the floor. Some cages still bore chains bolted to their walls, cuffs dangling as though waiting for wrists that would never return. Daniel's pulse thundered. He swept the beam further. A skeletal form slumped in one corner, knees drawn tight to its chest. Scraps of rotted cloth clung to the bones. Empty sockets stared back at him through strands of hair still clinging to the skull. His stomach heaved, but he forced it down. The floor was littered with debris, shattered glass vials, toppled jars with faded labels, the rank residue of chemicals long since leaked. He recognized some by name: ether, chloroform, tools of both medicine and cruelty. The basement was not storage. It was a prison. It was a laboratory. "Jesus," Daniel whispered, his voice cracked in the silence. "This isn't a house. It's a goddamn dungeon." The drip of water answered, slow and deliberate. At the far end stood a table. Its surface was littered with relics. A scalpel blade rusted to orange, pliers caked in grime, glass syringes cloudy with residue. Dust coated everything, but the arrangement was clear. These were instruments of procedure, of experimentation. Daniel's flashlight beam found stacks of folders, their paper warped, ink blurred but legible in parts. He picked one up, flipping it open with trembling fingers. Subject A. Trial 7. Duration 2 hours. Termination inevitable. He dropped it back, bile rising in his throat. Another page bore scrawled notes. Test limits of endurance. Resistance stronger than anticipated. Must apply more force. When blood flows, the secret holds. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the light. He steadied himself against the wall, but it was worse there. His palm fell across gouges carved deep into the stone. Dozens of them, layered over one another, jagged lines etched by desperate fingernails. Pleas for escape, written in the language of survival. Daniel pulled his hand away as if burned. The echo of screams seemed to vibrate through the walls. He clenched his jaw, eyes narrowing. Bastards! The beam swung again and caught on another door. This one was smaller, wooden, its frame newer than the rest of the chamber, a crude padlock bolting it shut from the outside. Daniel's instincts fired. This was no relic. This was recent. He crept closer, the crunch of glass beneath his boots muffled by the hammering of his heart. Dust lay thick on the floor, but here, the layer was broken. Footprints smudged across the tiles, faint but undeniable. Someone had been here not long ago. He reached for the lock, his fingers curled around the cold iron, then tightened. With a grunt, he wrenched it upward, snapping the brittle latch free. The door banged open. The smell that burst forth was foul, worse than anything yet. It was the stink of sweat, of illness, of human confinement. Daniel swung the flashlight inside. A figure lay crumpled against the far wall. He was moving before he could think. He dropped to his knees, bringing the beam closer. It was a woman, young, though her face was drawn and pale, hair tangled into knots. Clothes hung in tatters from her thin frame. Her chest rose shallowly, each breath a tremor. "Hey," Daniel murmured, voice gentler than it had been in years. "Hey, can you hear me?" He touched her wrist, feeling for a pulse. Weak, thready, but there. Relief surged through him. He unscrewed the cap of his canteen and dribbled water onto her lips. At first it spilled, but then she swallowed, throat convulsing. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto his face. Her lips moved, words scraped raw. "I know the truth." Daniel leaned close. "What truth? Tell me." "They're not gone," she gasped. They never left. Her head lulled, consciousness slipped away again. Daniel stared, stunned. The name clicked in his mind like a trigger. He had seen her face before on a newspaper tacked to the bulletin board in Lone Ridge's diner. Missing. Marissa Kane, investigative journalist, gone 3 months while pursuing a story on the Ashthorne family. And now she lay in his arms, alive, barely. He gathered her carefully, lifting her slight weight against his chest. Memories of war hit him, hauling comrades from burning vehicles, dragging the wounded through alleys. The instinct rose, swift and certain. You don't leave someone behind. Not ever. He stepped from the cell. The flashlight beam jittered across the walls, across words scratched there. Help, please, God. The weight in his arms was light, but the weight in his chest was crushing. Every step up from the basement carried not only Marissa, but the burden of everything he had seen. The cages, the bones, the journal, the proof of horror. From outside came Iron Hoof's whinny, shrill and urgent, reverberating through the stone like a command, "Go now." Daniel gritted his teeth and pushed on. The stairs groaned under his weight. Marissa stirred faintly, her breath rasping. The door above loomed, its iron hinges a thin barrier between hell and the world beyond. He kicked it open. Cold night air rushed in, sharp and clean, burning his lungs. He stumbled out into the weeds, collapsing to his knees on the frost-tipped grass. Marissa lay across his lap, her face pale in the moonlight. He brushed strands of hair from her forehead, whispering, "You're not dying here, not in this place, not while I'm still breathing." A sound drew his gaze. Iron Hoof stood at the gate, eyes glowing, mane whipping in the wind. The stallion watched in silence, its massive chest heaving as if it too bore witness. Daniel held her tighter. The house loomed behind, its windows black and watchful. He knew in his bones what he'd found tonight was only the beginning. The true nightmare was just beginning to stir. Daniel drove like a man possessed. The old pickup roared over the dirt track, headlights slicing through the night. Marissa lay slumped on the bench seat, her head propped against his jacket, skin clammy under his touch. He kept glancing sideways, one hand gripping the wheel, the other steadying her shoulder every time the truck jolted. Her lips moved once, forming a soundless word. Daniel leaned closer, but no sound came. She slipped back into silence. "Hold on," he muttered, foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. "Just hold on." The lights of Lone Ridge shimmered faintly against the dark horizon, a cluster of sodium lamps glowing like a fragile promise. Daniel barreled down Main Street, the tires skidding as he swung toward the sheriff's station. He braked hard, gravel spraying, then leapt out and yanked open the passenger door. "Help!" His voice cracked the silence. "I need help now." He half lifted, half dragged Marissa into his arms, striding toward the door of the station. His boots struck the wooden porch hard enough to rattle the glass panes. He hammered his fist against the door. "Open up! Emergency!" Inside, a sleepy deputy startled awake at his desk. The man blinked at the sight before him. Daniel, wild-eyed, shirt torn and filthy, streaks of grime across his jaw. The deputy hesitated. "What the hell?" "She's alive," Daniel snapped. His voice was raw, gravel scraped across steel. "She needs a medic now." The deputy craned his neck to look past him. Marissa's limp body told the story. The color drained from his face. He grabbed the phone with clumsy urgency. "Sheriff, you'd better get down here now." The door swung open 20 minutes later, and Sheriff Cole Maddox stepped through. At 50, Maddox was the kind of man who seemed carved from the same granite as the ridges surrounding the town. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair streaked with gray, his uniform fit without a wrinkle. But it was his eyes that held the room. Sharp, pale, unreadable. They measured Daniel in a single glance, then moved to the woman on the cot where deputies had placed her. Behind him came 2 deputies, hauling a medical kit and a portable stretcher. They worked quickly, strapping Marissa down, securing an oxygen mask over her face. One muttered to the other, "Vitals weak but stable enough for transport." Daniel stepped forward. "I'm going with her." Maddox's hand came up, firm as a stop sign. "You've done enough, Raw. Let my people handle it." Daniel bristled. I pulled her out of a goddamn cage. I'm not standing aside now. You will, Maddox said, calm as stone. His tone left no room for argument. Yet his eyes lingered on Daniel with an intensity that was almost calculating. The deputies carried Marissa to the waiting ambulance van outside. Daniel caught a last glimpse of her pale face under the harsh fluorescent light. Then the doors slammed and the engine rumbled to life, whisking her away. Daniel stood alone on the porch, jaw tight, every muscle itching to follow. But the sheriff had already shifted gears. "Walk with me," Maddox said. It was not a request. They drove out together in a convoy, Daniel's truck trailing the sheriff's cruiser and another deputy's SUV. The flashing lights painted the pines in lurid red and blue as they wound down the back road toward Ashthorne Manor. The convoy stopped short of the gates. The great house loomed like a corpse under the moon, its broken windows glinting, its gaping doors yawning into shadow. Maddox stepped out, surveying it with a cool detachment. He barked an order. "Cordon the perimeter. Get some shots for the record." The deputies moved quickly, stringing yellow tape across the rusted gates. One of them snapped a few photographs with a digital camera, wide shots of the exterior, none daring to step inside. Daniel stalked forward. "You're not going in." Maddox didn't look at him. "No need tonight, we'll file it. Secure the site. Follow procedure." "Procedure?" Daniel's voice rose. "There are cages in the basement, bones, records of experiments. People died down there. One is still alive because I got her out. And you call that enough?" Maddox finally turned, his expression blank, but his eyes burning faintly. "We've seen what we needed to see. The rest will wait." "That's it?" Daniel stepped closer, fists clenching. "You're putting tape on the gate and walking away." The sheriff's lips curved, though not quite into a smile. "That's it." Daniel's breath steamed in the cold night air. "You're covering it up." Maddox's silence was answer enough. He signaled to his deputies, who finished their cursory sweep, then slapped a paper notice across the warped front doors. "Property sealed. Do not enter." When the others drifted back to the cars, Maddox lingered. He studied Daniel with a gaze that felt less like scrutiny and more like judgment. "You don't understand," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of iron. "Some things are buried for a reason." The words weren't advice. They were a warning. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I understand plenty." Maddox's eyes narrowed. "Do you? Men before you thought they could dig. They're gone now. Disappeared. No funerals, no graves. Just gone." His voice was calm, but beneath it throbbed something else. A veiled threat, or maybe a confession. The cold air seemed to thicken between them, every breath sharp as broken glass. Daniel had been stared down by insurgents with rifles, by commanding officers hardened by years of blood. Maddox's gaze was different. It wasn't the look of a man ready to fight. It was the look of a man guarding a gate, one he intended never to let swing open. Daniel stepped closer, shoulders squared. "I buried friends in the desert, covered their bodies with sand because there was no time for coffins. Their names never made it home. Do you know what that feels like?" Maddox didn't flinch, but his jaw twitched. "I won't let that happen here," Daniel said, voice rough, low. "Not again. Not to her, not to anyone." The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Two wills collided in it. One determined to silence, one determined to speak. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought the sheriff might lash out. Instead, Maddox leaned back slightly, the faintest shift of retreat. He exhaled through his nose, slow and sharp. "Don't bring trouble down on yourself, Raw," he said finally. Then he turned, walking toward his cruiser, leaving the weight of his words hanging like a noose. The deputies climbed into their vehicles. Engines roared, red and blue lights swept the trees as the convoy pulled away, leaving Daniel in the dust-choked silence at the roadside. He stood rooted, fists clenched, chest heaving. The manor loomed behind him, sealed but not silenced. The sheriff's warning gnawed at him, but so did the memory of Marissa's rasping words. "They're not gone. They never left." The night swallowed the last of the sirens. Then another sound rose from the darkness, a whinny, deep and resonant, rolling through the pines like thunder. Daniel turned. At the edge of the tree line, half veiled in shadow, Iron Hoof stood. The stallion's breath steamed in the cold air, eyes reflecting a ghostly light. Daniel's fingers curled tighter, not around a weapon, but into the simple fist of a man refusing to yield. The Mustang's cry echoed a second time, fierce and defiant. Daniel's chest eased. He whispered into the night, "I'm not alone." The horse tossed its massive head, glinting under the moon, and then slipped back into the trees. Daniel stood in the fading glow of patrol lights, realizing the battle had only just begun. Not against warlords or deserts, but against his own town, his own sheriff, and the secrets buried beneath Ashthorne Manor. And for the first time since leaving the battlefield, he felt that strange, dangerous spark. Purpose. The days after the rescue blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and cautious whispers. Marissa was kept in a rented room above a faded diner on the edge of Lone Ridge. The place smelled of stale coffee and frying grease, but it was safe enough, a corner where she could recover out of sight. When Daniel visited, he found her propped against a thin pillow, pale but more alert than she'd been the night he carried her out of the manor. Her eyes burned with a fever that wasn't illness, it was determination. "I have to go back," she said, voice still husky but firm. Daniel frowned. "You can barely stand." "I don't care. If we don't see it ourselves, if we don't bring something back, everything we found will vanish under Maddox's tape. You know it." He wanted to argue. Her skin was still too clammy, her hands trembling when she reached for her cup of water. But he remembered the sheriff's words, the casual way Maddox had sealed the manor like a crime scene that would never be solved. The warning had stung him, but also hardened him. Daniel set a small canvas bag on the chair beside her. Inside lay a hunting knife, 2 flashlights, and a digital camera he'd bought from the town hardware store. "If you're serious," he said quietly, "we go tonight before they tighten the net." Her thin smile was answer enough. By dusk they left, slipping out of town in Daniel's pickup. Headlights dimmed. The road twisted into forest, swallowing them in shadows. Lone Ridge fell away behind, and ahead the woods breathed a silence, only broken by the occasional crack of branches under their tires. The silhouette of Ashthorne Manor rose from the gloom as twilight bled into night. Its roofline jagged, windows hollow, the building looked more like a wound in the landscape than a house. Iron Hoof was there. The black stallion stood in the tree line, a colossal shadow among shadows. His ears flicked as the truck rolled to a stop, his body rigid as though recognizing the trespass but granting them passage. Daniel killed the engine. He and Marissa shared a glance, then climbed out, flashlights cutting arcs across the overgrown path. "Let's finish what we started," she whispered. Inside, the manor greeted them with the same oppressive silence, every breath carrying the scent of mildew and stone. They started upstairs. The upper rooms were collapsed in places, beams sagging beneath years of snow and rot. Dust motes swam in the flashlight beams. Daniel moved ahead, shoulders brushing cobwebs, eyes flicking to every creak and shadow. Marissa knelt by a half-rotted dresser. She pried at a drawer until it slid free, spilling a cascade of papers across the floor. Most were yellowed into near oblivion, the ink blurred into meaningless stains. But a handful of sheets still bore legible words, names, dates, figures. "Patient ledgers," she murmured, squinting. "But these don't read like a family's records, more like inventories." Daniel raised the camera and snapped shot after shot. His finger shook only slightly against the button. The wind hissed through a broken window, rattling the shutters. It sounded like a whisper crawling along the walls. Both of them froze, ears straining. But when Daniel aimed his light into the trees, all he caught was the glint of Iron Hoof's eyes, massive and unmoving in the fog. In a bedroom whose wallpaper peeled in strips, Daniel found a loose board near the hearth. He crouched, prying it up with his knife. Beneath was a hidden compartment lined with mildew. Inside lay a bundle of papers wrapped in brittle cloth. He unrolled them to reveal a series of notebooks. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, blotched with smears of ink that had bled across the pages. Daniel flipped one open. The words jumped at him. Project Replication, Phase 2, Behavioral Control through Neurochemical Compounds. Subject 12 terminated after 3 days. Tolerance levels insufficient. Note, blood must flow to preserve the secret. Marissa's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. Daniel closed the book, his jaw rigid. His mind reeled backward, desert heat and comrades writhing under explosions. Men who had been experimented on in different ways, tested by war, left broken. The echoes twisted with these pages until his breath came rough, like sand in his lungs. He forced the notebook shut and stuffed it into his bag. A wardrobe near the hallway yielded worse. Marissa opened a small cedar box hidden on the top shelf. Inside lay a stack of Polaroids. She held one under the flashlight and recoiled. The photograph showed a cage. Inside was a gaunt figure, hands gripping the bars, eyes hollow. Red numbers were scrawled across the bottom, 1968, 1102. The next picture was the same, but with another face, another date. Some of the photos were smudged with brown stains. Jesus Christ, Daniel muttered. He took the stack, flipping through them one by one, the fury in his chest mounting with each image. He pressed his teeth together until his jaw ached, then raised the camera and photographed every single picture. Marissa's voice shook. This isn't just madness. This was organized, documented. Daniel slid the box into his pack. And we'll make sure they can't hide it again. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the rage boiling just beneath his skin. In the library, behind a desk split down the middle, Daniel found an old safe. Its metal face was rust-flecked but intact, the dial frozen at an angle. He wedged the hunting knife into the gap and forced it open with the heel of his boot. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a set of official folders. Daniel pulled them out, a government seal stamped across the top. He opened one carefully. United States Department of Defense contractual agreement with Ashthorne Corporation. The language was clinical, dense, but the implications roared like artillery. Research into specialized human subjects. Application of behavioral modification, funding indefinite. There were signatures, numbers, seals, not forgeries. Marissa leaned over his shoulder, whispering. They weren't just monsters, they were protected. Daniel's teeth clenched. Protected by the same flag I bled for. The fury in his chest threatened to burn through him. He folded the files and tucked them away. By the time they finished, Daniel's bag was bulging with notebooks, photographs, and official documents. He photographed everything twice over with the camera and his phone, careful to angle each page in case the originals vanished. But he didn't trust the system. He didn't trust Maddox. So he selected a handful of the most damning originals, the contracts, the Polaroids, and slid them into an inner leather pouch. He strapped it shut and slung it across his chest. Marissa saw and stiffened. If they find out you kept those, let them come. His voice was low, steady, not bravado, but conviction. They already think I'm dangerous. At least this way, I'm dangerous for the right reason. Her eyes lingered on him, wide with fear and something else. Respect, perhaps, or gratitude. They returned to Lone Ridge in silence, headlights doused, the bag heavy between them. Back at the motel, Marissa wasted no time. She set her laptop on the small desk, connected a secure line to a contact in Helena, and began typing. Her fingers moved with increasing speed despite the tremor of exhaustion. The words filled the screen like a dam breaking. Ashthorne legacy, the hidden experiments. She wrote of cages in Montana, of a family who had sold their souls to science, of government contracts that turned human beings into test subjects. Her sentences alternated between description and accusation, her voice fierce, though her body still shook with fatigue. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, watching. He didn't interrupt. His presence was a silent shield, the same way he'd once guarded his brothers in arms. Marissa paused, fingers hovering. If I hit send, there's no going back. Daniel nodded once. Then don't stop now. She met his gaze, then returned to the keys. Midnight settled heavy over Lone Ridge. The motel was quiet, except for the clack of keys and the hum of the old heater. Daniel stared out the window. Mist clung to the glass, distorting the world beyond. Shapes moved faintly in the fog. Then he saw it. Iron hoof. The stallion stood just outside, massive frame blurred in the vapor, eyes glinting like embers. He was still as stone, watching, a sentinel. Daniel's chest tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. The horse had led him into the nightmare. Now it stood guard as the truth began to crawl into daylight. Then came another sound. A knock, soft, deliberate, at the motel's front door. Daniel was on his feet instantly, hand falling by instinct to the revolver that had once belonged to his father, now holstered at his side. The knock came again, echoing in the thin walls. Marissa froze, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Her eyes darted to him. Daniel raised a finger for silence. His heart pounded once, twice, like the beat of war drums. Whatever waited outside, the battle was far from over. The air around Lone Ridge changed after Marissa began writing. Daniel felt it first at the ranch, in the way the silence seemed sharper than before. The nights no longer felt empty. They felt watched. He would lie on the worn couch by the window, staring at the rafters above, and hear the faint crunch of gravel from the driveway. Once, twice, then gone. The sound of an engine sputtering to life, idling for a moment before fading into the woods. Some nights he swore he heard footsteps along the north fence line, a deliberate tread that stopped when he rose to check. By daylight, the unease didn't fade. One morning, Daniel found tire tracks curving across the soft earth near the entrance to the property. Fresh, wide enough for a heavy pickup. He crouched, pressing 2 fingers into the prints, feeling how sharp the edges were. Hours old at most. Everywhere he turned, he felt it, that prickling sensation along the back of his neck, the one that told a soldier he was being studied through a rifle scope. Iron hoof grazed often in the lower pasture, but even the giant stallion seemed restless now, ears twitching, head snapping up at shadows too far away for human eyes to follow. The threats came next. Daniel woke to his phone vibrating on the nightstand. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, just a row of digits with no name. He unlocked it. A single message glared back. "Stop now, Raw. Don't dig into what isn't yours." His jaw clenched. A second message appeared almost immediately. "If you want peace, burn what you took, tonight." Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. In the other room, he heard the faint click of Marissa's laptop keys. When he entered, she looked up, face drawn tight. "They know," she said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned. "I just got this." She turned the screen toward him. It was an email, unsigned. The subject line blank. The body read, "Your story will never see print. Walk away or you'll vanish like the others." Daniel swallowed the anger rising in his throat. "They're trying to scare you." "They're trying to kill the story," she corrected. He didn't argue. Deep down, he knew whoever was watching them had the reach, the resources to make good on every threat. But he also knew there was no turning back. The black pickup appeared 2 days later. Daniel had driven into town for supplies, wire, nails, a new lantern for the barn. As he rolled down the main road back toward the ranch, he caught the glint of headlights in his rearview mirror. A truck, black, windows tinted dark enough to swallow the driver's face. At first he thought it a coincidence. He slowed to let it pass. It slowed too. Daniel's gut tightened. He turned sharply off onto a dirt road leading to the lake, a detour that wound through pines. The pickup followed, keeping its distance, but never letting go. His pulse quickened. He pressed the gas, then braked hard, wrenching the wheel. Gravel sprayed as his truck skidded to a stop sideways across the road. He threw the gear into park, flung open the door, and stepped out, boots crunching. The night air was cold, heavy with pine. The black pickup idled 30 yards back, headlights glaring. Daniel stood in the middle of the road, shoulders squared, the old revolver heavy in the holster at his side. He raised a hand and beckoned. "Come on, then." His voice carried across the dark. The truck didn't move. For 10 seconds, the standoff held. Then the engine revved, and the vehicle reversed smoothly into the trees, disappearing down a side track, swallowed by the forest. Daniel exhaled hard. His instincts screamed, this was no prank, no drunk local. That was surveillance. Professional, deliberate, the kind of tale he'd seen overseas before ambushes. The war had followed him home. It happened at dawn 2 mornings later. Daniel was in the yard scattering hay, the horses crowding around the troughs. The sun had barely crested the ridge. Mist clung to the fence posts. A gunshot split the silence. The crack echoed off the valley walls, sharp and vicious. Daniel dove instinctively, rolling behind the water trough. Splinters rained as a bullet tore into the fence post inches from where he'd been standing. Wood chips stung his cheek. His ears rang with the familiar thunder of gunfire. He pressed his back to the trough, scanning the tree line. A flicker of movement. A man in a dark jacket, cap pulled low, crouched behind the north fence line. Too far to see clearly, but enough for Daniel's instincts to map the threat. The man raised his arm again, a glint of metal in his hands. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he turned and sprinted toward a waiting truck hidden among the trees. The engine roared to life. Daniel cursed under his breath, muscles coiling to give chase when the earth itself seemed to shudder. Iron Hoof erupted from the pasture. The stallion charged with a fury that rattled the ground, mane flying like a banner of night. His shriek split the air, deeper, more primal than any gunshot. He reared, front hooves crashing down so hard the earth shook. The would-be shooter faltered, stumbling in mid-run. He looked back, wide-eyed, as the colossal Mustang bore down. For a heartbeat, it looked as if Iron Hoof might trample him into the soil. But the man scrambled into the cab of the truck, slamming the door just as the horse crashed against the fender with a bone-jarring clang. The vehicle fishtailed, wheels spitting mud, and roared away in a cloud of dust and exhaust. Iron Hoof stood in the yard, chest heaving, eyes glowing with a fire that seemed almost human. He tossed his head, snorting, steam rising in plumes from his nostrils. Daniel watched from behind the trough, adrenaline burning through him. The horse was more than wild, more than legend. It had become a protector, a sentinel, a guardian of the ranch. For a long moment, man and beast locked eyes across the churned earth. "Good boy," Daniel whispered hoarsely. Iron Hoof snorted once more, then turned back toward the field as though his duty were fulfilled. When the dust settled, Daniel rose, brushing hay from his coat. He walked to the splintered fence post where the bullet had struck. His fingers traced the fresh gouge in the wood, still warm at the edges. He let out a bitter laugh, low and dry. "The battlefield never left me," he muttered. "It just changed shape." The valley around him was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence after a warning shot, the kind that promised more to come. Daniel's eyes drifted to Iron Hoof, grazing now as though nothing had happened. The stallion's flank rose and fell with steady power, his presence looming over the pasture like a monument. Daniel realized then that the documents, the photographs, the truth he and Marissa had pulled from the manor, they weren't just dangerous. They were lethal. Holding them was no different than carrying live grenades with the pins half pulled. But this time, the cause wasn't a flag or a mission stamped with official orders. It was something more fragile, more dangerous, the truth itself. And Daniel knew he would bleed for it if he had to. The article went live just after midnight. Marissa hadn't slept in days, her body still weak, but her mind relentless. She sat hunched over the glow of her laptop, finalizing captions, double-checking files, linking photographs to scanned notes. Every keystroke was like hammering nails into a coffin that had stayed sealed for decades. The headline glared back from the screen when she hit publish: Ashthorne Manor, the secret prison in the Montana woods. The story unfolded in relentless detail: descriptions of rusted cages beneath the manor, transcripts from the journal, Polaroid photographs with dates scrawled in red, copies of the contracts between Ashthorne Corporation and the U.S. Department of Defense. She had threaded Daniel's testimony through every section, his gravel rough words a soldier's indictment of what had been buried in silence. When it went live, the page seemed to burn. Comments flooded almost instantly, people calling it a conspiracy, others crying for justice. Marissa closed the laptop and slumped back in her chair, trembling. "It's out," she whispered. Daniel sat at the window, revolver resting on the table beside him. He didn't celebrate. He just watched the dark outside, the faint sway of pines in the midnight wind. "They'll come harder now," he said softly. "Truth doesn't stay free without a fight." By dawn, the whole town knew. A flyer had been pinned to the board outside the diner. "Community meeting tonight." Town Hall, 7 p.m. Word spread faster than wildfire. By the time Daniel drove Marissa into Lone Ridge, the streets buzzed with voices, groups huddled on corners with papers in their hands, everyone whispering, Ashthorne. The town hall hadn't been this full in years. Rows of folding chairs lined the floor, everyone occupied. Men in denim jackets, women with tired eyes, teenagers whispering at the back. The air vibrated with nervous energy, outrage, and fear. Daniel pushed through the crowd, a folder tucked under his arm. Inside were copies of the Polaroids and 2 of the contracts he'd risked keeping. Marissa walked close beside him, notebook clutched to her chest, though her face was pale. The murmur of voices dipped as people recognized them. At the front, the mayor called for quiet. "We've all read what's been published," she said, her voice shaking despite the microphone. "Tonight we'll hear directly from the man who uncovered it, Daniel Rohr." The room hushed, all eyes swinging to him. Daniel took the wooden podium. His hands gripped its edges, knuckles white. He had faced firefights, mortar fire, insurgents with eyes full of hate. Yet this, standing before his own people, felt heavier. He opened the folder and held up a Polaroid. The photograph's edges curled with age, but the figure behind the bars was clear. A man, skeletal, eyes wide with terror. Gasps rippled through the hall. Daniel's voice was low but steady. "These are not stories. They are not rumors. These are people, locked in cages beneath Ashthorne Manor." He set the photograph down, lifted another sheet. The ink had bled in places, but the words were still legible. He read aloud, "Blood must flow to preserve the secret." The phrase cut through the room like a blade. There was no sound but the hum of the old fluorescent lights. Finally, he laid the contracts flat on the podium. "These are signed agreements between Ashthorne Corporation and the U.S. Department of Defense. Sealed, stamped, official. You want proof this wasn't just a family's madness? Here it is. Our government paid for it." He looked out over the crowd, eyes sweeping faces he'd known since childhood. "I've been to war, I've buried brothers in the desert, but I never thought the battlefield would be here, in the soil under our feet. The people who vanished, the hunters, the travelers, the children, they deserve to be remembered. And the truth deserves daylight." The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly whispers built into cries. A man in his 60s stood, his voice breaking. My brother went missing in 1972. We searched every canyon, every trail. We thought he drowned in the river. God, all this time." Murmurs of recognition spread like fire. Women clutched each other's hands, tears brimming. At the far row, Eleanor Briggs, her hair white, her frame frail, rose shakily to her feet. She gripped the chair in front of her, tears streaking down her wrinkled cheeks. "I knew," she cried, her voice cracked but carrying through the hall. "I saw lights in those woods. I heard screaming at night, but if I told anyone, they'd say I was crazy. So I kept quiet. I kept quiet and people disappeared. I am sorry. God forgive me, I am sorry." Her sobs filled the room. Others joined in, voices tumbling over each other, stories of cousins who vanished, hunting partners who never came back, students who walked home and never arrived, tales once dismissed as drifter accidents, bear attacks, bad luck. Now each one sounded like a nail driven into Ashthorne's coffin. The hall shook with the weight of shared grief. Tears and rage mingled until no one sat still. Outside, news vans were already parked along Main Street. Reporters scribbled furiously, microphones aimed at the crowd spilling from the building. Within hours, Marissa's article was reprinted by papers in New York and Washington. On cable networks, anchors asked the same questions. Could secret experiments have been hidden in Montana? How deep does the connection go? By evening, hashtags lit up online. Ashthorne Secrets. Forgotten Victims. The story spread faster than even Marissa expected. Pressure mounted. The Justice Department issued a statement on the evening news. "We are dispatching federal investigators to Montana. A full inquiry will be conducted in cooperation with other agencies." In the town hall, the announcement played on a small television mounted high on the wall. The room erupted in applause. People hugged, some sobbing openly, others lifting fists as if, at long last, the silence had cracked. Marissa sat in the corner, pale but triumphant. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. She turned to him. "We did it. They can't ignore it now." Daniel's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to her. "We started it," he corrected. "But starting is the easy part." She nodded, her expression tightening. They both knew the deeper the truth dug, the more dangerous the shadows would become. When the meeting finally ended, people spilled out into the cool night. The air felt lighter, charged with something Daniel hadn't seen in Lone Ridge for years. Hope, but he knew hope was fragile. He lingered on the steps, watching the crowd disperse. Beyond the streetlights, at the far end of the field, a dark silhouette waited. Iron Hoof. The stallion's massive frame gleamed under the moon, mane rippling in the breeze. Daniel exhaled slowly. Marissa joined him, notebook clutched to her chest. Together they stared at the animal that had started everything by leading Daniel into the forest. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "We've stirred the storm. Now we better be ready for what comes with it." Marissa didn't look away. "We are?" The Mustang raised its head, letting out a low, thunderous whinny that rolled across the night. Daniel clenched his fists, the sound reverberating through his bones. Whatever storm was coming, he would face it, not alone, but with the truth as his weapon and with the Black Horse as his unyielding sentinel. The first SUVs rolled into Lone Ridge on a grey Monday morning. They came in pairs, tinted windows, gleaming tires crunching gravel. Agents stepped out, their jackets marked with bold white letters, DOJ, FBI. Yellow tape unfurled across the sagging iron gate of Ashthorne Manor. Cameras whirred as journalists crowded close, their breath fogging in the mountain air. For the first time in its long, shadowed history, the manor was no longer a rumor or a whispered threat. It was evidence. It was a crime scene. A sign was nailed to the rusted gate. Property sealed. Federal investigation. The Gothic silhouette of Ashthorne Manor loomed behind it, draped in mist, like a stage set for every nightmare the town had ever known. Reporters described it as Montana's secret house, their voices broadcast across the nation into homes that had never heard the name Lone Ridge until now. In the crowd gathered beyond the tape, townsfolk stood shoulder to shoulder, curious, grieving, vindicated, afraid. For years they'd traded stories in hushed voices. Now the government itself had marked the truth in bold yellow lines. It felt like justice, but it also felt like the beginning of something bigger, heavier, more dangerous. Sheriff Cole Maddox arrived late that morning. He stepped from his cruiser with his usual stiff grace, uniform pressed, hat low against the drizzle. Cameras swiveled toward him immediately, microphones thrust past the tape. "Sheriff, did you know about the Ashthorne family's activities? Why didn't the county investigate years ago? Were you complicit in the cover-up?" Maddox didn't flinch. His jaw worked once before he spoke, his tone flat, measured. "We are cooperating fully with federal authorities. That's all I'll say." It was nothing, yet everything. Daniel watched from the edge of the crowd, hood pulled low against the rain. He wasn't close enough to see the sheriff's face in detail, but he didn't need to. Maddox's eyes told their own story. Sharp, restless, more than a little haunted. The look of a man who wasn't merely being investigated. He was carrying a secret so heavy it bent his shoulders under the uniform. Beside him, Marissa whispered, "He knows more than anyone else in this town, and he's never going to admit it." Daniel nodded grimly. Maddox wasn't just afraid of federal heat. He was guarding something bigger, something that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. By midweek, Daniel's name was everywhere. Local papers hailed him as the veteran who exposed the Ashthorne horror. Journalists camped outside the ranch gates, shouting questions as he drove into town. Strangers pressed his hand at the diner, thanking him, sometimes with tears glistening in their eyes. Children dared each other to run up and ask if they could take pictures with Iron Hoof, the black Mustang who had become part of the legend overnight. But the praise came tangled with poison. On talk shows, commentators scoffed, "PTSD can cause hallucinations." "Are we sure Mr. Raw didn't embellish?" Another headline blared, "From hero to hoax." Questions surround veteran's tale. One columnist sneered outright, Daniel Raw's war stories have followed him home. Daniel felt the knife edge of it all, gratitude on one side, suspicion on the other. At the ranch, he found gifts on the porch, pies, jars of honey, hand-knitted scarves from old women who whispered prayers. And on the same days, he found his name slashed across online forums, labeled unstable, dangerous, opportunistic. Sitting on the porch with a mug of cold coffee, he muttered to Marissa, "In war, I knew who wanted me dead. Here, I can't tell who's shaking my hand and who's sharpening a knife behind their back." Marissa refused to let the smears stick. When a reporter insinuated Daniel had imagined the basement, she snapped, "I was there. I would be dead if he hadn't carried me out. That's not imagination. That's survival." She wrote a column that ran alongside her second article. The truth doesn't need decoration, it needs defenders. Her words were sharp, defiant. Daniel Raw is no storyteller, he is a witness. And sometimes witnesses bleed for the truth they carry. She gave interviews, her pale face lit by studio lights, always ending the same way. "If anyone doubts him, they doubt me. And I am not a ghost. I am alive because of him." Her voice didn't erase the smear campaigns, but it blunted their edge. Daniel wasn't just the lone veteran anymore. He was the man who had saved the journalist everyone now trusted as the messenger of Ashthorne's sins. But Marissa's hunger didn't stop with the manor. In the quiet hours, she pored through state archives, county records, and lists of missing persons stretching back decades. She spread papers across her motel bed, drawing lines with a pen, marking patterns only she seemed to see. "Look at this," she said one night, gesturing Daniel over. "Disappearances from the 60s through the 90s. Hunters, factory workers, kids hitchhiking home, most unsolved. And see here," she tapped at the maps, her hand trembling with urgency. "So many cluster within 30 miles of Ashthorne property." Daniel leaned closer. Coincidence? Not when the companies that own those parcels all trace back to shell corporations, all signed by the same lawyers, all names linked to Ashthorne. She was right, and when Daniel checked land deeds at the county library, he found exactly what she predicted. Tracts of land once under Ashthorne ownership, now hidden behind layers of corporate masks. Mining rights, timber rights, old ranches quietly bought and sold. It wasn't just one family manor, it was a network, a machine, and the machine had been running across the Pacific Northwest for half a century. The thought made Daniel's stomach twist. He had exposed one dungeon, but how many more cages rusted unseen in the dark? The night was cold when he stepped out onto the porch of the ranch, breath steaming in the moonlight. Iron hoof grazed in the pasture, black hide glinting silver under the stars. Each movement of the stallion seemed deliberate, ancient, as if the horse understood the weight of the secrets Daniel carried. Marissa joined him, clutching a folder thick with drafts and notes. Her face was pale, tired, but her eyes blazed. "We've opened a door," she said softly, "and what's behind it may be worse than anything we've seen so far." Daniel clenched his fists, knuckles white in the moonlight. "I've lived in the dark before. I'm not afraid of it. All I want now is to drag it into the light." The wind picked up, rattling the broken fence at the edge of the field. The boards creaked like a warning, like the groan of something ancient shifting in the shadows. Daniel stared into the black line of trees beyond the pasture. And for the first time, he didn't see a homecoming soldier or a weary rancher. He saw himself as what he had become. Not just a survivor, but a keeper of fire, carrying a torch into places built to suffocate it. And he knew the fight was far from over. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out, hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us. Winter arrived the way it always did in Montana, without apology. In the weeks after federal agents sealed Ashthorne Manor and reporters folded their tripods, the weather turned and the land exhaled a long, cold breath. Snow came in heavy bands and stayed, blanketing the valley until the familiar became strange. The fields of the Callahan Ranch, Daniel's ranch now, disappeared beneath a white sheet that dulled the edges of fence posts and swallowed the ruts of the drive. The wind threaded through the gaps in the boards with a low moan, and every exhale from Daniel's mouth rose as steam and vanished. He stood at the northern fence line in a canvas coat crusted with frost, a wool scarf tight around his throat. The air ached in his lungs. The world around him was a muted sketch in shades of blue and white. In the hush, he could hear his own heartbeat. The chaos that had roared through Lone Ridge, the sirens, the shouting, the cameras and their relentless blinking, felt far away, as if buried under the same snow that now covered the pastures. Nature had laid a clean sheet over the valley, a quiet shroud pulled up to the jawline of history. But Daniel knew better than to mistake silence for peace. The whiteness was not forgiveness. It was a pause, thin ice over deep water. From the fog that clung to the creek bottom, something immense took shape. At first, it was only a darker shadow in the grey. Then the outline clarified, the rise of a powerful neck, the long black banner of a mane crusted in sugar-fine snow. A chest that could have been carved from basalt. Iron Hoof stepped into view like a statue cut loose from marble. Snow dusted the stallion's withers and clung to the cords of muscle along his flanks. Frost starred the whiskers around his muzzle. His eyes caught the low light and returned it, twin coals behind glass. He didn't come close. He stood 20 paces off in the field, breath pluming, utterly still. A monument raised by the winter to the wild. A presence both real and more than real. Daniel met the stallion's gaze, and for the first time since the night in the forest, felt no edge of fear. Whatever Iron Hoof was, beast, omen, gatekeeper, he had become to Daniel a witness, a companion to the hard truths that men preferred not to see. He cleared his throat. The sound was small in the vastness. "The truth is out there," he said, voice roughened by cold and memory. "But is it enough?" His words broke apart in the wind and drifted away. He thought of the sealed yellow tape flapping against the manor's iron gate. He thought of Cole Maddox standing under a grey sky, jaw tight, eyes distant. The look of a man carrying knowledge the way a trapped animal carries a hidden wound. The DOJ press releases spoke in neat sentences, but Daniel had learned that neat sentences were rarely the whole story. Somewhere in those files were names they had not spoken aloud. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Did we only scrape the surface?" he asked the air. "Did we just wake it up?" Iron Hoof struck the earth once with a front hoof. The sound was dull, but carried in the cold, a drumbeat against a snow-packed stage. The horse's throat opened, and a whinny rolled across the valley. Not the bright call of pasture play, but a deeper sound, edged with iron and echo. It felt like an answer, not comfort, not closure. A summons. The stallion wheeled, immense power turning as if on a hinge, and trotted toward the tree line, his dark shape dissolving stride by stride into the winter fog. Daniel stayed at the fence long after the last breath of fog erased any sign of movement. The cold reminded him he was alive. He had spent years learning to feel anything without bracing for impact. Finally, he exhaled a long thread of vapor. "Maybe it isn't enough," he said. "Maybe that's the point." He thought of Marissa at the kitchen table, a blanket over her legs, eyes red with lack of sleep and bright with purpose. Pages spread around her like a cartographer's maps, lines drawn from one county to the next. She had told him last night, voice low, that one of the shell companies attached to Ashthorne Holdings had renewed a lease in a different state only 6 months earlier. The past, it seemed, was not finished being the present. He turned from the fence. The ranch house glowed in the afternoon's early dark. 2 rectangles of lamplight on the snow, a promise that the inside would be warmer than the world. He stepped inside, the smell of coffee and wood smoke folded around him. Marissa looked up from the table, pen still in hand. On the map before her, dots and dates had been arranged into a constellation that hinted at a shape, the outline of a story that had always been there and was only now being traced. "How is it out there?" she asked. "Cold," he said, a line tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Clear." She studied him for a heartbeat, then she nodded, turned one of the pages and said, "There's a site near the Idaho border I want to see when the roads open, a transfer station on paper, something else in practice." "Then we go when we can," he said. He poured 2 mugs and set one beside her. "One step at a time." She touched the mug but didn't drink, eyes drifting to the window where the snow fell in even lines. "Do you ever wish we could shut it all off and let the winter bury it?" He thought of the basement, of an oxygen-starved voice whispering, "They never left." He thought of Polaroids that had browned at the edges but not faded. He thought of Iron Hoof's cry. "No," he said, "I'm done with burying." He crossed to the small bookshelf under the window and slid a leather pouch onto the highest shelf. Inside were 3 originals he hadn't surrendered: a contract, a photograph, a page from the journal. He needed to feel their weight sometimes, to remember the cost of silence. "Maybe it's not enough," he said, echoing himself softly, "but it's right." He set another log on the fire, watched sparks lift and vanish up the throat of the chimney. Behind him, Marissa wrote a sentence, crossed it out, wrote a better one. The ordinary work of bringing light to dark corners, the kind of work that outlasted applause and outlasted fear. He went to the window once more. The yard was a page scraped clean. In the near distance, faint and already filling, lay a line of hoofprints pressed into the snow, a graceful curve where Iron Hoof had stood. The falling flakes began to soften the edges, then to blur them. Soon the prints would be gone. But Daniel knew the horse had been there. He had felt the tremor of those hoofbeats under his own ribs. He had heard the call. "They'll fade," Marissa said quietly, joining him at the glass. "Only on the surface," he answered. He gathered his coat from the peg and shook the snow from it. The night would come early, as winter nights do. There would be chores to finish, calls to return, maps to study, letters from people who had found the strength to say, "I saw, and I remember, and I'm ready to tell you what I couldn't say before." He opened the door to the porch and let the winter in for a heartbeat, sharp, bracing, honest. The snow was falling harder now, steady as breath, patient as time. It touched the world without erasing it. It covered but did not absolve. He stepped outside and watched the flakes gather in the cups of the hoofprints, one by one, until they became small white mirrors catching the low light from the house. Then he turned back in, closing the door with a finality that felt like a promise rather than an end. Out in the field, the wind drew a veil across the last visible trace of Iron Hoof's path. The veil would hold until a thaw, or until another set of tracks crossed it. Beneath, the impressions would remain. The horse, silent witness of the deep woods. The soldier, bearer of a truth stitched together by scars. The past, waiting beneath winter's sheet, patient and unspent. And the snow kept falling, laying down quiet on the valley, drifting over the hoofprints until they were gone to the eye, yet not gone at all. Not from the place where the story had already started to show itself and would not, could not, be hidden again.